Tu m'entends? Ouais. Andrea, toi, ça va?
Hello?
Hello.
Yeah? Okay.
It's great. Okay, let's start. But thank you very much for joining us today for a second conversation. My name is Alice Dusapin. I am an editor and a publisher. The conversation today will be in English, with my poor English. So I was invited by the Fondation Ricard and Paris Internationale to think about a program for Paris International Art Fair. It's a second edition. Last year I had the opportunity also to develop this program and welcome a number of guests every day. Under a title I have written that way, talk with and about artistic practice, publishing and curating in non-institutional environment and spaces, and what does it mean. And this year I added a new category, which is collecting in non-institutional environments. So last year there was Dorothée Perret from Paris magazine, Evan Moffitt from But magazine. We welcome as well Anna Collin from Open School East in London, the project space of Faro in Lisbon, run by artist Alexandre Estrella, and the non-profit space Giselle in Marseille, and finally Anthony Huberman, who directs Giorno Poetry System, which is the John Giorno Foundation in New York. And the idea behind this program is to share through a series of conversation the complexity and experience of personalities and artist curators who have founded, managed, and run non-institutional spaces. And to give very quickly a little context around this program and address a more personal story, I am the co-founder of an art magazine called Octobre, a publishing house called Daisy, and a non-profit space called Ampersand. So I have 2 feet in non-profit projects. But recently, after like 14 years trying to build those 3 projects, I have recently joined an institution in Villars-Arson in south of France, where I run the publishing department. So I have 1 feet, one in institution and one in non-institution, and I like to I was thinking that it could be great to talk about the difference, the similarity, the exchange, the different signature. So today I'm very happy to be joined by Andrea Andersson. So Andrea, you're the founding director and chief curator of River Institute for Contemporary Art and Thought, a cultural non-profit organ for artists of the global diaspora based in Nouvelle-Orléans since 2020. Working with artists at the border of art and archives, figure and ground, text and textile. I love these parts of your text. You commit to a study of indefinite field of art writings. And you work as well with Siglio Press, and you have co-edited a series of artist books. In recent years, you have edited publication and organized exhibition with artists, including Yto Barrada, which is, as we know, very important, Helen Cammock, Montes Michie, Cecilia Vicuña, Tina Giroir, who is an artist that we see a performance in the background. And very recently, meaning last week, you opened a show with artist Bettina, Original Order Original, the art and archive of Bettina at Ruth Arts. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So maybe to give also a little bit of context and to start by the beginning, I wanted you to maybe talk about the creation of River Institute in 2020. How do we create a project like this?
How do we create it? Somewhat by necessity, to see a kind of model and a kind of working that I didn't otherwise find in my environment. Rivers is based in New Orleans. I'm originally from New Orleans, but both of my parents are immigrants to the United States. And I had lived away for a very long time and then had come back. And in many ways, my work with Cecilia Vicuña was a bit of a kind of proto-model. Cecilia and I began working together around 2016, I think. And at the time, she didn't have gallery representation. And some of you may be familiar with Cecilia's work. She was born in Chile, and her practice has lived and figured both in a world and conversation of poetry and poetics, as well as object-based art and social practice. And my own background is actually, I kind of came to this field through poetry and poetics. I was a professor of poetry once upon a time. And so I knew Cecilia as a poet first, and therefore I knew Cecilia really before the art world had reclaimed her, or reclaimed her work in its own context. So at the time, she hadn't had an institutional show in maybe 20-something years, maybe more. I remember being in her apartment, opening boxes that had been closed. They had New Museum tape and writing on them, but they were from 1991. And these were her precario, which are comprised of all sorts of found objecthood that are valuable to her and make meaning through assembly. So maybe a particular precario might have a string and a wing and a rock, and they maybe have been collected across places and times, not all gathered from the same site. And she forges them together by hand, not with any kind of adhesive that's permanent. So at the end of the, when you take the show apart, you take the precario apart. And we ended up building this large project in New Orleans. And this was a durational relation. It was a relationship with Cecilia first and foremost. And it took a long time to make a book with Siglio, about to happen. And there's a word that Cecilia uses in Spanish, but the translation is "and about to happen," which is a noun that I quite love, and about to happen. And so this show, some might have described it as a retrospective, but for us it was actually, we called it our introspection. Inside of all of Cecilia's works, or all of the other works she's ever made, at least there's a logic system of that. And so this was before a lot of things happened in Cecilia's practice, Documenta and Venice and Tate Turbine Hall and all of this. And so but in that time, I experienced what it meant to work with an artist over a very long time and not know where we were going, but that it was a study. And it was also about showing work. And at this time in the United States, it was the way that the discourse was expanding, which was important, was very much about a kind of representational gesture of ensuring that all kinds of bodies were in, not only in the space, but also represented in the work, but also usually familiar. So, in New Orleans, we are going to trace these very particular histories. And Cecilia had never been to New Orleans before. There isn't a Chilean community in New Orleans at all, really. So what does it mean to actually recognize yourself in someone else's history? Because then Cecilia's work exploded, right? Because we can talk about the histories of the petroleum industry in our waterways. We can talk about neglected communities, indigenous communities. We can talk about the wetlands. We can talk about all of these questions and ideas that are core to Cecilia's work. And I think that's when I realized that what is defining about the New Orleans context, there are lots of ways that the city has been romanticized and codified and circulated, but it's really as a site of migrational people. And there's like, okay, now I understand why this work is entirely legible here. And it's because if there's something that we know about having come from someplace else, and also that we are going to have to go someplace else. My children are the first generation to pretty much know that New Orleans may not be there in their later adulthood, certainly not as we know it now. It's a wild kind of knowledge. It's a precario, it's to know vulnerability every day and to move differently in that space. And so the origins of rivers is to organize a cultural organ that really holds that brilliance of information that is born of and invested in migrational imaginations.
So maybe to tell the audience, River Institute, you produce exhibition and extensive publication, and produce not in the sense like you think and produce knowledge around.
Those things happen.
Yeah,
I would say there's sort of after effects. I think we are first and foremost a research organization. When we began as we founded a foundational partnership. There was a very important archive in New Orleans called Amistad Research Center, and the then executive director, Kara Olledge, who's now at the Getty, but at the time she ran Amistad, and we were both from New Orleans and had both left for decades, and both came back, and frankly both wanted to hit our head against the wall a lot. Things have changed, a lot hasn't, and we thought, okay, how do we do something? And we realized that we do it together. And so one of the other very early knowledge points for me about Rivers was that we're a very poor city, and I didn't want to add another organization to this community that needed support that was already short on supply. But I also didn't want to invite artists in and not be able to invest in their imaginations. So the way that could be done is through culling many together. So I always kind of think about this, mostly I think it's funny maybe that I always think about a snowball because snow is not very common in New Orleans. But this kind of snowball effect of how projects really grow in both momentum across time, but also take on more ideas, relationships, partnerships as it keeps moving. And so we built a residency program together where artists would first come and spend time in the archives, and it became a kind of cartography, a way of seeing where we are. And then from there, it really was, where does this project need to go? We don't have a physical space that we have to fill. And it's a bit of I think, a superpower for us in that we don't have to make an exhibition of a particular kind. So we've commonly begun with artist books, and it sort of extends our study for a long time before we even approach building exhibitions or whatever they need to be, which doesn't necessarily need to be an exhibition. And then across the time, we, because of our commitment, I think, to archives, and archives being so critical to how we think methodologically, we started to find ourselves in relationship to artist archives and estates. And so one of the first projects was our work with Tina Gerard, which brought us into exchange, and then more recently Bettina.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe there is few subjects, like words, that we can start the conversation also with. Like you said, and I liked very much this idea of the intelligence of the margins and peripheral spaces. And I think those two words describe vividly what the interests are. So maybe like the idea of the intelligence of the margins is something I would love to unfold.
I think that kind of language for me, I don't know if anyone has ever heard of the American poet Susan Howe. She's been very influential for my own thinking. And Susan has written many, many books, but books of poetry predominantly, but also books of theory, and writes a lot about marginalia. And that has always been, by far the most exciting place for me to find ideas is in the scrawl at the edge of things. But it's also in that relationship, I think, between center and periphery. It's not really about the margin. It's those lines of power and struggle between them. And the film that was on view a bit ago by Tina is a piece that was filmed here at the Palais de Tokyo in 1977, and it is called Grand Passé Partout. And it's such a brilliant title because Passé Partout in French, in here, is a master key. But in Cajun French, which is where Tina Gerard is from, it's actually a saw that you use to cut down cypress trees. It's a huge saw that is a very physical tool. And Tina's so funny to be able to use this word that moves and changes, and ultimately its Cajun use is really requires two bodies, right? It's not a solo affair because there's a handle on one end and a handle on the other, and you go back and forth, and that idea about edges and being able to kind of bridge spaces. She was also using in that film these fabric works that she called the Solomon's Lot. She traveled with them everywhere, and they were an inheritance to her. They were a kind of dowry from her uncle Solomon, who was a Palestinian dry goods salesman who moved to Louisiana in 1947 and married Aunt Daisy. And through them, she took hold of these highly decorative floral patterned fabrics that she didn't really know what to do with, but started traveling and performing with them everywhere. She was in 74 when she was in, I think it was 74 in Documenta, she washed them in the Fulda River and then suspended them from the trees to dry. It was so beautiful. But always in community. They're so long, someone else has to hold it with you. And so this idea of suspension and being able to bridge one point to another is sort of, I think, critical to what River's work is, and it is not lost on me that we are we're really full of mimicry. We are copycats. Whenever we're working with artists, we start to shapeshift organizationally because we work so intensely for such extended periods that I know that we start to take on those imaginations for ourselves, right? So, you know, Tina is an artist who was from Louisiana. Her family is from Acadiana, which is the Acadians in Cajun country. There are there as a result of a forced migration from Nova Scotia, many through Haiti and then to Louisiana. And then she moved to New York in '66 and was very close and was part of the foundation of the Ann Architecture Group with Gordon Manna Clark, and Food the Restaurant, many different undertakings. But this idea of being a subject whose inheritance is migration became, you know, so moving materials. Here, she would go to Louisiana. She would say, "I go to Louisiana to gather," and she'd gather feedstock bags and linoleum and cheap things, and then bring them back to New York, and then they mean something else there. And so they perpetually were. It's the same things again and again being invested with new meanings.
So maybe also a very simple question, but how do you build a program? Because also, as you said, you don't have a physical, a public space. You do have a space, but it's not a public space where you when we go and see shows, you have partnership with other institutions and spaces, actual spaces. So where the shows are sent somehow, and the same for the books, the extensive research. So I was wondering how you build up the program and how a project is ready to be sent.
Yeah, I guess I would say that we don't send a project, but so I'm interested in the verb because it helps me reflect back on what we do. I think one of the things that we did in our very early years is that we built relationships. And part of what's fun for me about Rivers, we're actually a 2019 founding. I'm sure I wrote 2020 someplace wrong. But so we're entering our 7th year, and so much of our time has been getting to work with people we so deeply admire, but not doing it once, really. We've sort of identified those across the field who inspire us, but also who do have different skills than our own. So this isn't a kind of duplication of institutional knowledge, but to work with an archive is to inherit and all of this other kinds of ways of knowing that's different, and to work with those who have a physical space that they're responsible for and a community that they're constantly calling out to, a kind of fixed community. So across time, Siglio has become a great partner. The press, Wendy Subway is another American press, and Dancing Foxes, and also other organizations that have physical homes, like the California African American Museum. We have done a number of projects with Kim and the Contemporary Art Museum in Texas, Cara in New York, are all some of those places where I often think, we're only 4 people, but I don't feel like we're only 4 people, because I have all of these colleagues in all of these other institutional spaces with whom I think alongside all the time. And so when we're building projects, when we're talking to an artist, right now since 2023, we have been working with Alia Farid. She was an artist in residence with us and has stayed on with us as a fellow, and that project has grown and evolved and shapeshifted. And we will release her artist book with Siglio in 26, and in 2027 we will organize together with Cam Houston. It will present at the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston, and that project has been such a great study for us to think about what we laugh about and call gulfiness, again another really good noun, but to the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Mexico may feel very far from one another, but they are bound by all sorts of socio-political and economic ties that are not very hard to hide. And so this information about wetlands and whether that's maroon communities or insurgent, we have different words for different things in different places, but there are so many echoes and parallels between our communities.
And also, like before, when we were having a coffee and trying to not exchange too much to keep it fresh, I was telling you that it takes time to understand what we do, and I think being part of building up a magazine, a publishing house, and a project space, I feel it took me 10 years to understand what was the signature, what was the interest, and to explain again the story after living it. And I feel like I was very, and I'm still, I admire so much River Institute for that also, because right at the beginning, I felt that you knew you had a set of tools that what non-profit but institution need to produce extensive research and be close to work and really support the artists. And it felt like you had, decades of experience. So I ask you, how did you, I don't know if there is an answer, but how did you build up this story right away? When
I think
launching.
I had decades of non-experience. I don't have a long history in institutional spaces.
Maybe that's the key.
But truly, I've never worked in a museum. And when I arrived in these spaces, it's quite shocking what isn't there, right? If you have been if you've been living your life, I don't know, for me, having spent so much time in the world of poetry and poetics, it was I still miss this idea of working with forms that are inherently political and mutable, and also not really, they don't carry currency for most. It's such a privilege to work with something that isn't worth anything to most people, which is to say the power structure is different, right? And so how to build an organization, but for me, writing grew to expand beyond the parameters of of books and of where we are used to coordinating it, containing it. And so for me, Rivers is an extended project of writing, and so it uses so many of the methodologies of writing, but how can that be done with other kinds of signs and sign systems, and what can we bring in from these other environments in which writing is very alive, and where we think about context and form and politics and shape and grow things across relationships, and so all of this information that Rivers was using is quite commonplace in other contexts, and so I think it was more of an importation, and something that we started to talk about briefly, and then we said, no, don't talk about anything, because we'll talk about it, it'll get tired before we talk to anyone else. Something that's different in, I think, the United States than here in France is just the construction of a nonprofit, which also involves a board. And most organizations in America construct boards in a very particular way. Your board members will fund your organization. And so that is a particular power structure, and it invites commonly a set of principals who have that capacity. And while Rivers would surely benefit from all kinds of, what we recognized early on is that there are all kinds of resources that a board can endow, and mostly what we would benefit from would be thought partners, people that we can think with about what should this be. And so that's how we have constructed our board, is through, again, relationships. So I mean, in very, almost everything that I could say about Rivers gets distilled into a set of relationships that we've been evolving. And those relationships, it's a feedback loop of sort of nourishment. So, there's only so much intelligence that I can, I have my perspective, and it is what it is, and I can lend, a particular shape of making to something, but then it gets really good by all the other hands that touch it, all the other perspectives that disrupt it and turn it upside down and refuse it. And I always think about this one moment. A very old and dear friend of mine is named Cameron Shaw, and she's the executive director of the California African American Museum. And we were working on Troy Montes Michie's work, and we decided to present that exhibition not by any wall text that about the work, but really just context. And somewhere written in the text was the word, the Watts riots. And it was about 2 seconds. It was like, we call it the Watts Rebellion here. And it was, okay, this is why we collaborate, is because I am limited by my own experience, and now this project is enriched by those who have a very different set of relationships to this. And it was a transformed project, not because of what I was putting into it, but because of the exchange and the sort of compounded expression.
And I think also this idea that you shared, that because in a very classical way, we could say that getting bigger will be an involvement, and I think something to keep the work intimate and to have a small team is something that is also a luxury. And maybe to talk about this idea that to not getting bigger is something that will maintain a closeness to the work, and to letting the work shape you rather than a bigger structure. Because I think this idea also that even if it's a cliche, but sometimes when a structure is here and you have time to share knowledge, and when everybody is like, and then I think I listened to a podcast you said, and you were like, we are all in the same room touching the boxes, opening them and sharing ideas, and this proximity is create preciseness.
Yeah, there are many reasons to be small. For us, it is as much of an economic reality of like, this is what we, you know, I founded Rivers with no dollars, right? So it was sort of a promise with my partner, can I go for a year and not bring in an income? And he was like, okay, yeah, you got a year, go for it. What do you know? And it was a feverish year of writing grants, and we were very fortunate to get some very meaningful grants that gave us security and multi-year security. And I think about much more than bigness. I think about or size of the size or the scale. I think about is duration.
Yes.
How to keep going, right? So when I brought on my first person, it was like, do I know that I can pay this person for 3 years? Can I promise that to myself and them? Okay, can I pay this next person for 3 years? And so, you know, I would never want someone to leave a good job without having some sort of like, you know, anchor. And we don't have any illusions, as I was describing earlier with my children, of permanence. That's not. I'm not trying to keep Rivers alive forever, but we have some places to go, and we have work to do and commitments to artists that are like, I need to know that when we start this, we'll be able to go the distance with an artist. So it's like, how do I think about, can I fund this for 4 years, 5 years that it might take to become the snowball that it has to become? And so, you know, so much of our work is invisible, and we were talking about this earlier. And I don't mean to, maybe invisible is not the right word. It's non-public, right? So that house we have is it's a residential home in the Bywater neighborhood of New Orleans, and has a very beautiful garden and a good kitchen, and artists stay there for extended, but only one at a time. It's not good for people who don't know each other well. And we have dinners there, and we have conversations, and it's a wonderful, intimate space, and a lot of work gets done in that space. And I can, you know, when one of the first trips that Alia Farid, like leaving Kuwait after, you know, COVID and having been there for so many, on her way to Puerto Rico, I think was New Orleans was her first stay for a stretch. And, you know, we ended up out in we took a boat craft out into the bayou, out way, what people call the end of the world. And it's really an extraordinary kind of ecosystem. And we were out in the wetlands. And this is, again, this sort of non-public, which is to say, so much of Alia's work is involved in the wetlands of Basra. These are different wetlands, and nowhere will these figure by name, right? The fact that we spent this time out in this boat is never going to be in the work, but it's in the work. And so, and the work is something different because it's in the work, right? And that sort of transnational information or transcultural information. And it was such a funny day because we're out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it's true. I can't overstate this, except that we're in the heart of the American petroleum economy. And so her phone starts blowing up. I didn't even know we had coverage out there. And she had, you know, won this big prize out of Oslo. And so the whole world was writing her, and she was south of everything in Louisiana. And we ended up celebrating by our boat captain dropped us off on this edge of there was an unmarked door, and I thought, where are we going? And opened in, and it turned out half of Venice, Louisiana was in there, eating catfish and drinking Barks root beer, and that's where we all celebrated, and it just felt absolutely like right on. This idea of there's lots of this work that happens outside of the work that will become public, but then when it does, that durational relationship, I think, is evident in what gets shared. It can be felt in something, even if it can't be read.
Sorry, time is running, and I wanted to. We should talk about Bettina.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
But I had like a silly, pragmatical question to ask you. Like, is there things you're doing better now after 7 years running?
I hope so.
And I was like, yeah, as people wants to run a nonprofit space or a program, like, is there skills that we learn while doing it, and what it will be?
About a year and a half ago, I felt a certain responsibility to, for us, and I felt this from the outset, that I needed to be real, right? I needed to circulate in this room, in these circles, in a way that had credibility. And so there were lots of things, I think, that we did initially that said, "Oh, we're an arts organization." That's how you can tell. I've done that, and so I started to think, "Oh, I need a succession plan. What would not for now? I'm not going anywhere now, but I should be hiring for whom I will pass this mantle to, and like all we built this thing, and so I was doing lots of best practices of as we say in the United States for nonprofit work, and I stopped caring at all. I was like, oh wow, I don't even want to do rivers anymore. I can't wait for the succession plan to start. Can I pass this off? Because this was getting so codified into a thing that it was losing all of its vitality for me. The more I tried to invest it with permanence or with credibility, or this, have all of these features that are easily recognized. Should we be having an event, an annual fundraising event? We don't have an annual. Oh, we should have a dinner. All of these things that we're supposed to have, and it stopped being something I felt like I should really keep going with. And the moment I started to think I was going to quit it, then I felt free again, and then I started thinking differently again, and then I liked it again. And I was like, oh no, actually, what I need to do is not try to fix this thing into something that is for everyone. It's not going to get more popular. I know that. Like, this is a thing for some people. And for those people, I hope it holds a lot of meaning and value. And it's not going to be for everyone, and it's going to change because it's going to have to. And new people, even in our team, I'm sure that our organizational group will continue to evolve, and that will change it, just as every artist that comes into our program, it changes what we think we do for a living. And then it got very exciting again.
Yeah, that is so nice. I mean, that's beautiful. I think that's the key, to be able to start again. That's beautiful. Maybe let's talk a little bit with the few.
Yeah, I can be very short about this, but I might begin with a quote that is a Bettina quote. So a few years back in 2019 and 2020, and across COVID, I was working with the artist Yto Barrada on an exhibition, and we sort of laughed. By the time we presented in 2021, we were both like, do we have to show this? Didn't we already, we were essentially making drafts of an exhibition, and we'd redrafted and redrafted and redrafted, and we'd thought of so many exhibitions in the meantime, and the exhibition that came out of it was Ways to Baffle the Wind, which was, of course, another kind of draft. During that time, Yto, we were up in North Adams, which is where Masmoka is located, and staying together. And this is when Yto made the decision to take on the responsibility of the estate of the artist, the late artist. She was dying at the time, Bettina, born Bettina Grossman, and So we have been along for this ride for the beginning, and often you'd go to Yto's studio, and usually a conversation with Yto, you think you're beginning one place, but you go nowhere near there, and you're someplace else very swiftly. And so we're usually opening boxes together, So what evolved was our undertaking a very large project entitled Original Order, Order Original. And in the history in the sort of language and verbiage of archival work, the original order is the order endowed by an archive's creator. And there's a lot of information invested in where and how and the contextual relationships of the pieces. There is a way that one could make a strong case that it should not be disturbed. And yet, you can't make anything new out of that. And so there is the original order, and then there's the order original, which is all of the other sets of relationships that one can find between the many pieces. And in the case of Bettina, she was already identifying always all of the other order originals. So we have been archiving, cataloging, working, it's the kind of thing when you open a box, it's, as you move here, you can kind of, this is one of her Leporelli, which are these scrapbooks that she made of her own work. And, for us, you can get quite close if you use the plus sign, and this becomes a kind of cartography quite swiftly. It actually uses this website that's not live yet. We'll be, we're still in development with this project, but we'll be launching it in about a month's time. And you'll be able to click on individual works to trace them through the catalog, but it does function using Google Map technology, which is, we think is quite funny. But this work is an interesting one for us, and Bettina lived in the Chelsea Hotel. Prior to living in the Chelsea Hotel, she traveled quite extensively, and then she lived in the Chelsea Hotel from 1966 until her death, and spent a lot of time alone. But she describes, I think there's a kind of, I think one of the reasons Bettina's work is so important to us is that there's someone who has moved in life and physically moved, and the reason she moved into the Chelsea Hotel was because of a massive fire in her studio, in which she lost everything. And so this is her, this archive that we're unearthing is really her teaching us how do you begin again after just fierce destruction and loss. And at this particular moment in time, I think it has become such an important project for us about when there is so much losing, and losing so much of life and tradition and culture and government and protection, how do you start again making? And so I want to read this one quote from her in which she said, in describing that after she'd been constantly changing countries, and she said that she worked with constants. If you take a constant, which could be an absolute, and evolve it through the process of change, maintaining the same one constant, it is like generating a life, and it evolves the same way a human being does. And, I think working with Bettina's work, it's not just, how do you make after so much loss, but how do you sustain a life? And I think it is through this kind of perpetual evolution. And what you're showing here is this taxonomy that we've been building, and we've been going through the archive, and this is not a fully built out. I can maybe share. I can bring to you. Let's see. I don't know if it's easy. Just an example of how some of this might work. So in the coming weeks, we'll be building out so much of the archive that we've cataloged, and then grouping works by this terminology, and it will allow people to also see other works that are in that she applied certain words to. But I share all of this. This will become public and usable, and I hope some of you may find yourself back here. But what's important to me about it, I think right now in this moment, is to think about how we keep things moving, organizations, practices, and we've invited a number of artists of writers to take a word from the taxonomy and to use it, just to put it to work. And I think, in her practice, she's lived by a photocopy center in New York called Kinko's. And she would go to Kinko's every morning of her life, and she would make collages, and she'd reproduce, and she would create these documents that I can only describe as like postulates, because they're not paragraph form. She never wrote about things, but she would pair these words, and then she would pair them with works, images, so image text. And when we were talking about it, how would we define these words for another? And I just kept going back to like this, college seminar I think I was in, and I think we were learning Heidegger or something, and it was like, a thing is a thing because it things. And, at 19, that was quite bewildering, but I think, a work, she used a word potato chip. It's a potato chip because it potato chips. And so how do you show it happening? And so, we've invited all of these writers in to use these words. And it's kind of, it's not my idea. It's a really good idea that Samuel Johnson had when he made his first dictionary. And he talked about, he wrote at length about how his frustration of writing a dictionary, because the moment a dictionary enters the world, it's already obsolete. The language has changed, right? Language changes. You use it, I use it, and now we have new words, right? Words that didn't exist 5 minutes ago. And so I think the key of Bettina's practice is that she used everything. And that's how she invested it with meaning. And so inviting other people to come into this archive to order original it, to use it, and to give it meaning through that exchange is so critical. And I think that's what, like for us, we are going to just use the materials that we have available to us, whatever they are, in very changing times. And that will be what we are the tools that we put to use.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for this
beautiful
conversation. And thank you for your attention. And have a good day.
Thank you all.